moving on to the latest news on the COVID origins, if we can put up this, I think it's R6. This is the preprint that kicked off so much news coverage over the past week, beginning in the Atlantic, which was based on some interviews actually with Christian Anderson, who we were just speaking of, Robert Gary and others. Those are authors now of this preprint. The New York Times did 2 major pieces off of this.
They got great publicists, these guys do.
And so
but that's the thing. I don't think they have publicists. I think they just have direct lines.
Direct access, right?
I don't think
it's
they do.
It's the credibility factor.
You're totally right. I'm kidding.
Right.
They'll just swallow it,
And so we're still joined by Dr. Jonathan Latham, virologist and the publisher, editor of Independent Science News, Sam Husseini, reporter who writes on the Substack, husseini.substack.com. Thank you again, guys, for joining us. And so I'll start with you, Dr. Latham. So now that we've had this entire news cycle, as the cycle dies down, now we get the preprint, which, to be clear, for non-scientists, including myself, is not a peer-reviewed paper. But at least it is something that is written down on paper. And so as you've digested this preprint, how does it match up with the New York Times and Atlantic headlines that were so definitive in saying we can now link the origins of COVID to a raccoon dog in the Wuhan market?
So, I mean, right now, what we get to see is how weak the underlying data is, right? And the fundamental issue is that they find raccoon dog DNA, but they also find many other kinds of DNA. None of the raccoon dog DNA demonstrates that the raccoon dog was infected with a virus. This is an animal market where raccoon dogs are for sale. So finding raccoon dog DNA is a little bit unsurprising. But what the data shows is that SARS-CoV-2 RNA nucleotide sequences were basically all over the market. But the fundamental point for me is that the dating of this is all wrong, right? We know that the outbreak almost certainly started in September or October, and maybe even earlier than that. That is approximately the consensus. We know that there were people sick in Italy, for example. There are samples from Italy in November. So we know that the outbreak started months before these samples were taken. Therefore, these samples are irrelevant to the beginning of the outbreak. And I would say that the Huanan market was not, there's no evidence even that the Huanan market was a super spreader event. It may simply have been representative of Wuhan city at that time, when there were thousands of cases of COVID in the city.
And it's really obviously hard for a journalist in January, February, March of 2020 to know what questions to ask, to ask that questions about the samples and the timing and all of that. That doesn't excuse them not asking those questions. And Sam, I'll toss this question to you. You may both have thoughts on it. Whether we're talking about Ebola or COVID, the publicist thing is kind of funny because it's funny, but it's sad because it's so true that when people come with a preprint, put it in the media, and give it their spin, reporters are susceptible to just swallowing that spin and running with it. So when you look at this preprint now, when you look at how the media reports on difficult subjects like these, what disconnect do you see between the inability then of the press without medical expertise to translate that into information the public needs?
I don't think that the public and the press should be, have this deferential, this appeal to authority. Mm-hmm. Science, like journalism, is about observing the world and using reason to draw conclusions. It's a fairly simple proposition to say there's a lab nearby. Could that have something to do with it? And then when their response is, oh, people thought the same thing when this other outbreak happened when there was a lab nearby, the logical conclusion would be, okay, so you're telling me there's another case.
Right, yeah.
So maybe that's the issue. that would be the reasonable way to look at it. But the establishment scientific community and the sort of Jon Stewart line that somehow science is the problem, that curiosity will kill us all, that's wrong too, because as I've looked at, for example, Peter Daszak, who funded the Wuhan Institute of Virology, dangerous lab work, The funding base for this is largely from the Pentagon and from USAID. This militarized view, way of looking at things has perverted science. And you had scientists speaking up about this. I mentioned the anthrax attacks earlier. In 2005, there was a letter of 700 scientists saying you're perverting our field to the NIH, saying you're putting so much money, studying these dangerous pathogens, you're messing up with our field. It's no longer becoming a scientific inquiry. And it was Fauci who told them to put up or shut up. The government has told us that they want this work done. This is what we're going to do. So science isn't the problem. The problem is a militarized view of science. And in terms of the recent report, this isn't the first. There have been a series of these highly publicized reports saying, "Oh, yeah, it didn't come out of a lab."
The Nature article, right?
And a year ago. Roughly.
There was one in August of last year, right before Jeffrey Sachs flipped on this. I think the net effect of that is just to confuse the public. That is, insiders are like, these guys are really burning their credibility, right? But it's the net effect of it is to confuse the public mind so that the public doesn't demand answers, that the public thinks that this is, maybe it's nothing after all.
Muddy the waters.
Totally muddy the waters. And it really reminds me of after, 20th anniversary after the Iraq War, after the Iraq invasion, people might recall there was a series of stories where they claimed to have found the WMDs that all ended up falling apart. Why did they do that? They did that to muddy the waters so that there was never a moment of reckoning. And I think that that's what a lot of these scientists are really hoping, that there's never a moment of reckoning.
Yeah, and Dr. Latham, all of these reports that we're talking about tend to be driven by roughly, it seems like, half a dozen kind of key virologists. And I saw a biologist saying on social media the other day that he felt like he was able to engage in this conversation in a more open and dispassionate way because he's not in the field of virology, and so his career would not be negatively impacted by his scientifically coming to a conclusion that is impolitic within his field. So I'm curious, for you as a virologist, what has been the reaction over the last 3 years to you raising questions about what these half dozen virologists have tried to say is kind of settled science?
My challenge is a little bit different because I'm not in an academic department. So I have a PhD in virology, but now I run a nonprofit. And so I don't have to face my colleagues every day and explain to them why I am contradicting, what appears to them to be in their best interest. But you see, I can speak to some of the emails that we've seen. For example, there's a classic one in which some of Ralph Barrick's colleagues, so Ralph Barrick is at the University of North Carolina and collaborated with, or proposed to collaborate at least, or in fact did, if I shouldn't say proposed, he actually did collaborate with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And they email each other and they say, our jobs is to keep our heads down at this point, right? And because they know how weak these stories are, but at the same time, they cannot stand up and contradict them for fear of their careers. And the problem is that, classically, scientists have tenure exactly so that they can speak freely. But scientists in many institutions don't actually have tenure these days, or feel that they don't have tenure, or feel that they will essentially lose everything if they speak out. And it's clear that the Lancet letter accusing people who discuss the lab leak of being conspiracy theorists and having this published in a premier journal and have a whole constellation of very prestigious scientists sign this letter, it constitutes a threat to the scientific, anybody in the scientific community who might consider speaking out on these subjects. So it's been clear to me that there's been a campaign of intimidation. But I don't have to worry about it because I'm independent of that ecosystem, if you like.
There's been so much conversation about how and accusations that people who are suppressing the lab leak debate are protecting China. to the point you just made, Sam, it actually seems to me the real problem is that people like Anthony Fauci, who weaponized these charges of racism, which is really an interesting juxtaposition with what happened with the Ebola outbreak, it may have been a situation that was the other way around and gets to how cynical all of this is. But when you look at it, it actually seems as though what they were really protecting was the United States, because the source of this funding, time and again, goes down to the Pentagon, goes down to groups like EcoHealth Alliance that are primarily funded or largely funded in many cases by the United States government. So it's been strange to see that narrative play out, that this is all about protecting China, when in fact, if anything, it seems to be protecting the U.S.
That's absolutely correct. There are sort of two strands of the U.S. establishment. One wants to target China, and the other one wants to make sure that the United States government continues with this dangerous lab work. A terrible development, to your point recently, is that a large part of the public now thinks that Congress unanimously passed and Biden just signed legislation that would declassify all information regarding COVID origins. This claim was made on Fox. This claim was made on U.S. In the Washington Post. It's been made by the sponsors of the legislation. It's not true. If you read the legislation, what it says is that we direct the Director of National Intelligence to declassify all information pointing to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So that would mean that they wouldn't have to declassify the information pointing to other institutions, or potentially even information exonerating in some way, as unlikely as that might seem, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And meanwhile, the public is being told, we're declassifying everything pertaining to this. So that is a setup for a very dangerous situation. The public thinks that what's being declassified is everything, when that's not the case at all. As a matter of fact, there's massive, even unclassified information isn't being FOIA'd. The Intercept did a fair amount of this. U.S. Right to Know did a fair amount of this. I was just at the State Department asking them why they still have not responded to FOIAs from almost 3 years ago by U.S. Right to Know, a transparency group, which has had to start litigation. So there's massive, withholding of information while the public is being led to believe, oh, we're opening up the books here.
And I saw a video of Sam yelling at Ned Price to release that information. Sam, if you recognize Sam, it's because you've seen some of his viral videos. He's often in the State Department briefings, tangling with the State Department spokespeople.
It's good stuff.
Yeah, it's enjoyable stuff. I've told Sam I'm going to start going to State Department briefings. Those look more fun than the White House.
They have better chairs, more spacious.
The more cantankerous the hearing room, the more peaceful the outside world, is my philosophy.
And Dr. Latham, one last question. I just wanted to put to you kind of the best case that the market origin types make, and see what your response to it coming out of this preprint that we just put. They put up a heat map in their in their article that shows kind of an intense amount of kind of COVID RNA sampling coming from the exact same portion of the market where they can show that now that these raccoon dogs were being sold, and they say that that's very strong circumstantial evidence that why would you have more COVID here than you would have in the rest of the market? So what's your reaction to that claim that circumstantially that this is strong evidence?
Well, I mean, there's two issues. One is that we don't know if we have access to all the data at this point. And the second issue is that I believe there's also a toilet at that part of the market. So people are coming and going and using that toilet and basically potentially hanging out there, maybe a line. We don't know. There's so much that we don't know. And I think that, the basic issue comes back to the timing, right? I don't think we can ever get away from that. The timing of this sampling is so late in the pandemic that it really can make no sense to identify raccoon dog DNA. I mean, even if you take the best case scenario that there was a raccoon dog infected with SARS-2 in that market, the likelihood is that raccoon dog caught it from a person and not the other way around. And so the evidence that they're putting forward, all told, is ridiculous to me.
Right. It doesn't explain how a February infection could spark a September, or October, or even November or December. And in fact, I'm a time travel expert. It couldn't even spark an outbreak in January. So
the breadth of Brian's knowledge surprises me.
I'm going to call the Atlantic with that and see if I can get an article printed. Jonathan, Sam, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now, and Sagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us, and if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.